in his name. Amen. You can have a seat.
Well, good morning, fellowship. My name's Tad. I get to serve here on the student ministry team, and I'm really excited to be in here with y'all this morning because Esther is genuinely one of my favorite books in the Old Testament, probably right behind Genesis. I love it. I think it's so just gripping, some of the way that it's told. I studied English in college, and so I find even just some of the creativity of the way that this inspired text also brings to light some just really amazing human creativity when it comes to storytelling, to tell us something about God and help us learn about his plans for us and what he is doing around the world and how he intends to save his people. And so I want us to dive in. We're going to be in chapters 5 through 8 this morning in week 3 of Esther. We're right in the middle of Esther before we start Daniel, which again is also probably an Old Testament favorite. And so I'm just pumped that our church is studying these books right now, and I'm excited to see what God teaches us as a people through it. So if you have your Bible, open up to Esther chapter 5. But when we get to like the middle of a series like this, I find it helpful if we do like a recap of the story. Like, where have we been? What's the story about? Because I know some of y'all probably haven't been here the last 2 weeks, and so if you're new and you're just jumping in, I want you to be caught up to speed on what the story of Esther is and what's going on before we get to chapter 5 and then through the section today. And I'm going to be honest, I kind of want to do so in like a really silly way. So y'all humor me a little bit. I'm a student ministry guy. We have some fun over there. I want us to have some fun when we look at Esther. I got in a really funny conversation with my team this week about what if you were to cast modern day like actors in the story of Esther and like remake a movie, and then it devolved further, and we were like, well, what like Disney characters would you put in this story that would like be each character? And so we're gonna tell the story of Esther as told by Walt Disney. If you're watching online, I don't know if you'll be able to see some of the pictures. I've got some really hideous clip art that we're gonna go through, but I'll try to make it clear for us to follow along. So, once upon a time, in the capital of Persia, in the city of Susa, we're introduced to this extravagant King Xerxes, who I imagine is a lot like Prince John from Robin Hood. He's kind of an idiot a little bit in the story. It portrays him. And at the beginning, he's like showing off all of his might and all of his riches and his wealth. And to be honest, he's kind of got a little bit of a drinking problem. And so whenever you got the drinking problem like this and he's been partying for weeks on end, showing off his wealth, he also wants to show off some other stuff that makes him feel great. So he wants to show off Queen Vashti, his queen, and say so everybody can see how beautiful she is, but she turns him down. She's like, no, I'm not gonna let you objectify me. So he just tosses her out. He's like, I'm done with you. I don't want you anymore. But then he starts to feel kind of sad, and he's like, I'm lonely now. And his friends are like, well, why don't you throw a beauty pageant with all the women of Persia, and you just pick your favorite? And he's like, yeah, good idea. So then he meets Esther. Esther's one of the women that's caught up in this really unjust system where he's trying to find a new wife, but he's got hard eyes for Esther. And he's like, I like you. I want to make you my queen. And so he does. Turns out, though, there's some backstory going on. Esther is the cousin of Mordecai. She was orphaned as a child. She's been raised by her cousin Mordecai, who I imagine is kind of like Cogsworth from Beauty and the Beast, because he's like this wise advisor, And so, but he gives her some wise counsel, and he's like, hey, keep it secret that you're Jewish. Don't let the king know. I think you should keep back that information just for your protection. Don't let him in on that. So she's like, all right, cool, I won't. And just so happens, Mordecai, he's one of the kind of the wise guys in the cities. He's hanging out by the king's gates with all the other elders of the city, and he overhears a plot. Some people want to assassinate King Xerxes, and they're sneaking up behind him with the knife to assassinate the king, just like Scar did, And he goes and he tells Esther, there's a plot forming, and she tells him, look out. And so they take the conspirators and they impale them on poles. Because that's what they did in ancient Persia with criminals. They would just skewer them on a kebab. So that happens. Now enters a really terrible character in the story named Haman, who's a lot like Jafar from Aladdin. He's the king's second in command. He's really selfish and is kind of working a subplot for his own good. It turns out, though, him and Mordecai hate each other. They don't like one another at all. There's some backstory there. Haman feels like Mordecai doesn't show him the proper honor when he walks down the streets. And actually, there's even like some family feud from generations back. If you go read 1 Kings, Haman's a descendant of King Agag, who had duked it out with King Saul of the Israelites, and Mordecai happens to be from the same tribe as Saul, the Benjamites. And so there's this long family feud. They hate each other. And again, Haman feels very disrespected by Mordecai often. And so he's like, I got to kill that guy. And it's not enough that I kill him. I'm going to use my opportunity here to have all the Jews killed. And so he devises this plan, and he goes to King Xerxes, and he's like, hey, I think it'd be a great idea if you killed all the Jews. And so they set a date, they put it on the calendar, like on that date, we're gonna kill all the Jewish people across the entire Persian Empire. And he's trying to convince the king to do this. And the king, likely, probably a little bit tipsy, is like, sure, you see my drink, let's just do that, sounds good. He doesn't really care, he's not paying much mind to the story here. And so the story continues. Mordecai learns about the plot. He seeks help from Esther. He says, you've got to help us. You got to go to the king. Maybe you could do something since you're the queen. You've got to leverage your position here to save your people. And she's like, I can't go before the king without being summoned. And in fact, he hasn't summoned me to see him for months. So I don't think I could just approach him. If you just approach the king without a cause, you can get killed. I'd be risking my life to do this. And he's like, you've got to do it for your people. Don't think that you could avoid this, that you'll be safe. You have to go and risk everything to save your people. And who knows, Esther, maybe you've come into the place of the queen for such a time as this. Get it? Because he's a clock? Get it? I got that one from Aaron Parks. All right, so she decides bravely, I'm going to do this. So she says, if I perish, I perish. All right, we're up to chapter 5. Let's dive into the story from here on out. If you're following along, we'll have some key passages to read along with. Esther puts on her royal robes, and she stands in the inner court of the palace in front of the king's hall. She's waiting to go in, and she approaches. He's sitting on the throne. And so there's this tense moment. What's going to happen? Is he going to let her in? He does, because he's still got mad hard eyes for Esther, and he says, whatever you want. What's your request, Esther? Up to half my kingdom, I'll give you whatever you want. And she says, what are you doing for dinner? I'll tell you what I want, but first, why don't you bring Haman over to my place tonight, and I'll throw you a feast, and then I'll maybe tell you what I want. I'll let you know my request. So she's kind of got him on the hook. He's intrigued. He wants to know what's going on. So they go to Esther's for dinner, and they're hanging out, and he again asks, what do you want, Esther? You can have up to half my kingdom. And she says, I'll tell you tomorrow. Come back again with Haman. She's really got him on the hook now. He's got to be really intrigued. What is it, this request that she has that's so important that she's kind of being secretive about it? But they agree, and they leave. And so Haman, though, he's feeling himself in this moment. He thinks he's the man. He goes home and he throws an after party. And he gathers his whole family together. He gets his wife, who I imagine had to look just almost exactly like him, because he's so self-glorifying. He'd just be attracted to a woman who looked exactly like him, because he's in love with himself. But he's bragging about all of his stuff. It says he boasted to them about his vast wealth, his many sons, all the ways the king had honored him, and how he had elevated him above all the other nobles and officials. And that's not all, Haman said. I'm the only one that Queen Esther invited to go to the banquet with the king. I'm so special. I'm so awesome. But then he remembers, but none of that gives me any satisfaction as long as Mordecai sits at the king's gate. I hate that guy. I can't be content with my life because I stinking hate Mordecai so much, which is really sad, right? That he has almost everything he could want. But this rivalry has gotten him so bent out of shape that he can't enjoy the life he has. And so he's talking about how he hates Mordecai, and his family suggests to him, why don't you just set up a giant stake in the front yard and go to the king tomorrow and ask if we can impale Mordecai? Wouldn't that be a fun idea? And Haman loves the idea. He says, awesome, I'm doing that. But what's going on back at the palace, you might ask? Well, I'll tell you. The king is lying in bed awake, and he can't sleep. It says the king could not sleep that night. And so he ordered that the book of the Chronicles, the record of his reign, be brought and read to him. And so they bring in the storyteller, who's the same guy from The Princess Bride, and he reads him a bedtime story to help him get to sleep. And as he's sitting there, it just so happens that they read about Mordecai and how he exposed the assassins, the king's officers who had tried to kill him and conspired to kill him. And it just so happens that the king is feeling generous. He says, what did I do to thank that guy? And Grandpa says, nothing. You did nothing for him because you're very selfish. He says, I should probably do something for him. He says, yeah, you're right. So next morning, Haman strolls up to the palace, excited to ask the king to kill Mordecai, his enemy, but he gets cut off before he can bring up his request. And the king says, hey, how should the king honor a great man in whom he's well pleased? And of course, Haman thinks he's talking about him. So he describes this really, really extravagant parade. You should put that man on the king's horse, put him in the king's robes, even let him wear your crown and carry your scepter. Parade him around town, chanting, look at this amazing man whom the king loves. You should all want to be like that guy. And the king says, that's a great plan. Go do that for Mordecai. And that's just terrible for Haman. He takes Mordecai and does exactly as the king said. And the king said, don't neglect a single thing that you suggested. Do it all for Mordecai. And so he leads him on a parade through the city saying, look at this man that everybody should want to be like. He's amazing. He's amazing. And the whole time he was very, very sad about it. In fact, he goes home and he tells his family about how terrible this situation is. And even they kind of turn on him and they're like, hey, if your downfall has started and Mordecai's of Jewish origin, then you will not stand against him. And they're all like, you're probably going to die. They immediately change their tune. But before he can respond, he gets whisked away to the palace for Esther's second feast. And they get to dinner, and the king asks, all right, Esther, tell us, we've come back. What is it that you want up to half my kingdom? And she tells him, she says, if I have found favor with the king, Majesty, if it pleases you to grant me my life, that's my request, is my life. This is my plea. Spare my people. That's my request. For my people and I have been sold to be destroyed, killed, and annihilated. If we had just been going to be sold into slavery, I wouldn't have bothered you with this, but I don't want to die, and I don't think you would want your queen to be killed. But there's a conspirator who's set up this whole thing. And she finally turns the table and she points out, save us from Haman, the villain, the one who has plotted to have us killed. And the king turns and he's very angry about it. He storms out, but then he storms back in, and as Haman is groveling on the floor, clutching at Queen Esther's dress, saying, please don't kill me. The king thinks that he's assaulting the queen and says, I'm going to kill you. And they take him and they have him impaled on the very stake that he set up for Mordecai. Come full circle. And now the villain is dead. And so the story ends. Esther and Mordecai are with the king. And they don't reverse the edict, but they make a way for the Jews to defend themselves. And in fact, it says that Mordecai is elevated. He goes out from the king's presence wearing royal garments. He puts a crown on his head. And the whole city of Susa held a joyous celebration. For the Jews, it was a time of happiness and joy, gladness and honor. In every province and every city to which the edict of the king came, there was joy and gladness among the Jews, with feasting and celebration. And in fact, many people of other nationalities became Jews because the fear of the Jews had seized them. And they all lived happily ever after. That is Esther, as told by Walt Disney. So that's our story. All right, that's Esther. Hopefully that gets us caught up to speed on what's going on in this amazing story, this book. Some of you might be thinking, that's really silly. And yes, it is. And maybe even, hopefully not irreverent. But the point of telling the story this way, of kind of leaning into the humor of the story of Esther, because I really think that the writer of Esther did some of these things like this on purpose. That when you look at the story and you read it for what it is and in its time and its context, there's actually a lot of humor and irony and exaggeration, all to make a point. I think this story, inspired by the Spirit of God to teach his people something, and yet also bringing into terms that God partners with human beings to share his word, and it brings to the table the ingenuity and the creativity of the Jewish writers as they write this story down to communicate to other people about the amazing sovereignty of their God. And they would use things like irony throughout this story. And they use a device that we're probably not that common or associated with called the chiasm. Here's kind of our English class type thing. A chiasm. If you have your Esther Daniel book, there's a chart on page 10, I believe, that outlines this story. And I hope you can maybe see the text on the screen. But essentially the pattern of a chiasm is it would take a story and almost fold it open in half. And each side mirrors the other, either with exact correlations or sometimes opposites. But these scenes that rhyme one another. And they all converge at the center, to the central part of the story. And that's kind of like how they would write something in bold. It's really creative and poetic, a way to tell a story. At the beginning of chapter 3, you'd see that Haman is elevated. But by the end of chapter 8, it's Mordecai who's elevated. At first, there's an edict against the Jews. Now there's an edict for the Jews. There was a conversation with Mordecai and Esther. Now there's a conversation with Esther and Xerxes. And right at the middle of this story, the climax of Esther, the part where we're really supposed to be paying attention, is these scenes that involve Esther's feasts and what happens. The writers creatively designed this story to tell us something and arrange the parts of it creatively to draw attention to the central part that they're trying to convey. To help us see it clearly with just kind of one of the instances that mirrors itself. Isn't it interesting and ironic and almost humorous in a dark way that Haman prepares a parade for himself and a pole for Mordecai, and yet by the end of this story, we've done a complete backflip, and now it's Haman on the pole and Mordecai getting the parade, being honored and elevated. They've done a total 180. It's ironic. It's extreme. And this radical reversal though, is supposed to communicate something to us. I think these true events that are being told, and yet the writer is arranging it in a way to help us see something and employing the creative devices of a chiasm to draw attention to something that's happening here. And for the clever reader, for the one who's been paying attention, who's been watching closely to see this, they would likely be reminded of an age-old truth that is written all across the scriptures, both in the Old Testament and the New. And it is this concept, this idea that God opposes the proud and shows grace to the humble. It says in Psalm 138, though the Lord is on high, he regards the lowly, but the proud he keeps from afar. Jesus himself says in Matthew 23, whoever exalts himself will be humbled, but he who humbles himself will be exalted. Isn't that exactly what happened in this story with Haman? He tries to exalt himself, and yet he is shamed and humbled at the end. Peter picks up this same idea at 1 Peter 5. He says, God resists the proud, but gives grace to the humble. Therefore, humble yourself under the mighty hand of God, that he may exalt you in due time. James 4:6 says explicitly that. God opposes the proud and gives grace to the humble. And we see that on display in Esther. And I think we're supposed to pay attention to it. The author wants us to see this and to reflect on it. Because imagine you're in this seat of the Jewish people, and we're going to learn next week that this turns into a feast called Purim, where annually they would read this story, and one of the family members would get up and read the entire story of Esther to all the children at the table and maybe employ some silly ways to do it to keep their attention. And if you're being told this story as a Jewish person who's looking at their situation through time, this would be such an encouragement. God opposes the proud and shows grace to the humble. I wonder what it was like for the Jews in between this time of this story and the time of Jesus, when the Greeks finally took over the empire from Persia, and their temple was desecrated. And they're feeling completely lost from God, a million miles away from him. And yet, the family member gets up at the Purim celebration and says, we're gonna still do it. We're gonna read the story. Like that family member who every Christmas has to read the nativity story, no matter what the circumstances, right? That family member stands up, and by the end of reading the story, they're reminded, though it seems like we are being humbled right now, in due time, God will come for our rescue. And those proud that have come against us and who have desecrated our temple and our home, they've postured themselves against God. God will act. He will bring justice because God opposes the proud and gives grace to the humble. It also, beyond a comfort, might stand as a conviction and a warning. Don't give in to the lure of empire. Don't give in to the draw of power and popularity and pleasure and possessions like King Xerxes. Don't give in. Don't think that that's a better way to live. Humble yourself. That is God's way. God sees you in your humble state. And they would think about that when they hear the story of Haman and his ridiculous downfall. And maybe they would laugh, and it would bring some levity to their situation, and they would reflect on these truths that God has for us. But remember, the chiasm points to the center, and it draws attention beyond just that theme that God opposes the proud and gives grace to the humble. What is the writer trying to draw attention to in this story? What's right in the middle of that conflict between Haman and Mordecai? What happened right between Esther's two parties? What single unlikely event initiated the dramatic reversal of this entire narrative? The king could not sleep. Why is this the center of this story? What are we supposed to reflect on here? What are we supposed to ascertain from this moment? You're telling me that the king, who almost in every single scene has been portrayed as a little drunk, couldn't sleep that night, that he hadn't drunken himself into a stupor after Esther's party. And it just so happened that he took interest in that moment and wanting to know the affairs of his kingdom, so he called for the chronicler. And it just so happened that the storyteller happened to read the story of Mordecai saving him and protecting him from the assassins. And it just so happened that this king, who up until now has been totally greedy, totally self-absorbed, totally self-obsessed, is suddenly benevolent and wants to show some generosity. We've said it in here before. God is not explicitly mentioned in the entire story of Esther. He's never mentioned once. But come on, right? You're telling me that all those things just happened By chance? By irony? No, I think the author is intentionally leaving God out of the story to invite us to look between the lines, to search for him ourselves, to see his divine action throughout this story. It's brilliant. And God's name is nowhere in this story, but his fingerprints are all over it. And I really think in that moment, he turned the circumstances to oppose the proud and show favor to the humble. He demonstrates his sovereignty in this moment, and I think the author of Esther wants us to see that and wants us to be encouraged by that. Garland opened up this series by asking the question, what do we do when it feels like God is a million miles away and he's nowhere in our story? I think the story of Esther reminds us that he's everywhere. He's in between every single line, in between all the space between the letters, on every single page of your story. At work, he's sovereign. He's over everything. And the story of Esther ought to remind us that. And so just as Peter said in Peter 5, if God opposes the proud and gives grace to the humble, then the natural outcome, the way we ought to respond to that, is by humbling ourselves under the sovereign hand of God. That we would recognize our God is in control, even when circumstances suggest otherwise, that he is working a better plan beyond what we can see. Just as it says in the Testament, that God works everything to good for those who love him, even when we can't see it. So humble ourselves under his hand. Trust in his divine plan. Believe that he is for our good, that he knows us. And again, that also though serves as a warning, that he sees when we posture ourselves over others, when we elevate ourselves unjustly in this world. We don't want to set ourselves up as God's opponents. We want to fall on his grace. Remember that while we were still sinners, while we were still his enemies, he died for us. And we want to fall on that and trust in his sovereign plan. Humble ourselves in that way. I want to end practically, though, or I wanted to end practically. But after thinking this and seeing this on the pages of Esther and thinking through what does it look like to humble ourselves under God's sovereign hand, because I'll be the cynic in the room. I'll be that person. That sounds great, Dad, but what does that look like? Especially when circumstances are bad. What does it look like to humble ourselves under God's sovereign hand? Like you can memorize that verse, but practically what do I do? That's harder than it sounds. And you're right. And I wish I had like a very tangible, practical, step-by-step list of here's what we should all go out and do this week to humble ourselves under the sovereign hand of God. But I don't know if it's there. I don't know if Esther and Mordecai had a specific game plan for that either. And so I want to kind of land on presenting almost like another chiasm of sorts or a spectrum. And just something as I've been reflecting on and invite you into the tension with me as we feel the story of Esther and we try to learn from it and change our lifestyle because of it and really trust in God's sovereignty. That we could go a couple different routes. If we believe in God's sovereignty, on the one hand, we could choose avoidance. And we could say, if God's gonna work everything out for good, then I don't need to do anything. And I can just avoid it and step back and see how this all unfolds. I don't really need to do anything. I could just avoid it. But the problem with that's a ditch I think we should avoid, is because that ultimately displays a lack of belief in God's sovereignty. To avoid says, I believe in God's sovereignty, but not enough to take action that he would protect me in that, to not take risks. It also, I think, is a lack of humility because it says, I don't want to leave my comfort, and my comfort is more important than taking action for the sake of those that are being treated unfairly and being a part of God's redemptive purpose to combat the sin and the darkness of our world. I don't think that's what Esther did. In fact, Mordecai counseled her against it. Don't think you can avoid this. Don't think you can just be a bystander and watch. But on the other side of this, kind of standing on the other hand of the chiasm, or the rhyme to avoidance would be aggression and trying to seize control back. Notice Esther didn't poison Haman whenever he came to her party. Mordecai didn't go round up a renegade army to oppose the king. They didn't go towards outright aggression as their answer. Again, I think those ditches stand in front of us, and it's so easy to land in those places. It's really easy when we see the hurting of somebody or somebody being treated unfairly or experience a really hard loss to just say, it must have been God's plan. God will work everything together for good. And while that's true, doesn't that sound so heartless in the moment? And maybe sometimes we just say that to people because we don't want to just sit and feel grief with them. or step into the mess and be with them in that. On the other hand, we don't do the aggression route. Kind of that, we need to take back our fill in the blank mentality. We should go and seize back what we need for our good. And almost saying, my understanding of what God's will is better than everybody else's, and I'm gonna go achieve that and be God's hand for him. We gotta avoid those. I don't see Esther and Mordecai doing that. And yet somewhere in between, kind of in the tension of that space, somewhere between acceptance and action, maybe is where we're being drawn to, that central focal point of this story. That Esther in that moment had to accept the reality of her world. She accepted that I live in an evil, unjust world where people are mistreated and injustices go unchecked. And I recognize that my circumstances are beyond my own control. But it's not out of God's control. And he might have a greater end that I can't see. And yet, if God is sovereign, and I know based off scripture that the sovereign God delights to act through human beings who are humble and obedient to him, through his image bearers, then maybe he has positioned me for such a time as this to take action and to step in or speak up on behalf of those experiencing oppression or injustice for the good of my fellow man in the world. And maybe I need to do something and take some sort of action. And that tension between those things, I think I see that's what Esther did. She takes action. She denies avoidance, but she also denies the aggression and is willing to say, I know it's gonna take action, and yet I might have to die to myself. If I perish, I perish. And I think most of the time that we step into this, if we step into the tension, it would look like that we would self-sacrifice for the sake of our fellow man, that we would be a part of God's redemptive work by laying down our life for the sake of others. As New Testament believers, we have a significantly greater example than Esther because Jesus did this in the perfect way, in the way that saved us. We see Paul say to the Philippians, as you go about your life, have the same mindset as Christ Jesus, who being in very nature God did not consider equality with God something to be used to his own advantage. Rather, he made himself nothing by taking the very nature of a servant, being made in human likeness, being found in the appearance of a man. He humbled himself by becoming obedient to death, even death on a cross. Therefore, God exalted him to the highest place and gave him the name above every other name. God did not avoid the sin and the brokenness and the injustice of the world by saying, I'm God, I'm above all this, I don't have to intervene. He also didn't just absolutely burn us and smite us and say, if that's what you want, be gone. He accepts us as we are in our broken state and still loves us, and yet he has to take action out of love for us to save us from our sins and the things that we do to destroy ourselves. And Jesus perfectly entered into that tension space by humbling himself, self-sacrificing out of love to save us. And if we want to be his followers, if we want to make a difference in the world, if we want to take his message of the gospel and redemption and renewed relationship and recreation and resurrection to the ends of the earth, we'll probably have to do what he did there. Enter into that tension space at our own expense at times to say like Esther, if I perish, I perish. I have the mindset of Christ. What would it look like to do that? And I hope that as we continue our series through Esther and into Daniel, that we would keep thinking like that as a church. And we would ask God in those quiet moments with him, Lord, what are you calling me to do? I accept that you're in control. And I recognize that you've made me to take action in this moment. So would you give me the wisdom to do so? Would you work your good plan? I trust you. Would you pray with me? Father, thank you so much for the story of Esther and how we can learn from it even today. I think the story is beautiful and it challenges me to no end because I know that oftentimes I give in to the impulse to be more like Haman or Xerxes than to be like Esther and to lay down my good for the sake of other people. Would you change that in me? Or as we look to you, Jesus, and we see your example and the way that you have loved us Will we love others the way you love us? Even being willing to lay down our life for them, whatever that looks like, to take risks, God, because we believe in your sovereignty. We know that you have us. You're in control. We love you.